No. Let me ask a question. What is in your pocket? You know, I thought about doing something this morning, and I thought, I know money's a real personal issue. It's going to say, hold up the money that you have in your wallet. I've got $1. All right, we've all seen those, right? And you start putting some zeros behind it, and we see a little less of those, the more zeros that you put behind them, right? Well, here's a question. How many of these does it take to be considered rich? How many of these does it take to be considered wealthy? Now, there was a survey. I don't remember how long ago the survey was, but the survey said that basically if you had to have one to 5 million of these in order to be considered wealthy. Okay, that's quite a bit, isn't it, to have 1 to 5 million of these. What's interesting is that 55% of those that have 1 to 5 million of these do not consider themselves to be wealthy. It's interesting, there are many people that we consider to be wealthy, but they don't consider themselves to be wealthy. I don't know if it's embarrassing or what it is. But you know, when you stand back and you look at the bigger picture of what's in the world, poverty and wealth is relative depending on your situation, right? There was an exercise several years ago that I came across. Robert Hilbroner said that let's try this exercise to give some perspective on where we are. He said, take away all of your furniture except for one table and a couple of chairs and maybe a blanket or two. Take away all of your clothing except the oldest dress or suit and only one pair of shoes. Take away everything in your pantry except for a small bag of flour, sugar, salt, a few potatoes, onions, and a dish of dried beans. Take away your bathroom, shut off your water, remove all of your electrical wiring, and also place your house in a shanty town. Cancel all of your subscriptions, all of your magazines, because you can't read anyway. Leave only one radio in the entire shanty town. And move the nearest clinic 10 miles away and put a midwife in charge instead of a doctor. And also throw away all of your bank books, your retirement, your insurance, and leave the entire family a hoard of about $10. And give the head of the family a few acres to cultivate on which he can raise some cash crops. 1/3 of it will go to the landlord and 1/10 to moneylenders, and lop off 20 years in life expectancy. And he says this is the reality for a good number of people in the world. And that seems far removed from us. And this is just to give us some perspective, not to shame us, not to make us feel embarrassed, but to recognize that even the poorest among us, by worldly standards, may be considered wealthy by other people in the world. And it's also a reminder that when we read those passages in the Scripture about wealth, now I don't know if you read it the same, maybe I'm the only one that does this, but when you read passages about wealth, you kind of tend to read past them because you think, well, that doesn't really apply to me because I'm not wealthy. But you know what? You don't have to be wealthy in order to fall into the pitfalls that are associated with wealth. And so the lesson this morning is make the most of your wealth. Continuing with our Make the Most of It series. You know, the Bible has a lot to say about wealth and gives us some principles and instructions concerning our resources. And the first one is simply this. Recognize God as the source of all of our blessings. If you want to follow along, turn to Deuteronomy chapter 8 with me if you would. Deuteronomy chapter 8. Israel has been a nation that has been living for an entire generation out in the wilderness where there were very little resources. And they were totally and completely dependent on God. I don't know if you've ever been in the desert before. There's just not a whole lot out there. Maybe one person can survive, by eating an armadillo and drinking water out of a cactus for a while. But when you get thousands of people, then it becomes a real challenge. And so these people are about ready to leave that situation and go into a situation where, described as a land flowing with milk and honey, you'll have everything that you need, all of your delights. And here is the reminder that they're given as they go into this place where they are going to become prosperous. Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 11. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe His commands, His laws, and His decrees that I'm giving you today. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. He led you through the vast and dreadful wilderness, that thirsty and waterless land with its venomous snakes and scorpions. He brought you water out of the hard rock. He gave you manna to eat in the wilderness, something your ancestors had never known, to humble you and to test you, so that in the end it might go well with you. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms His covenant, which He swore to your ancestors, as it is today. When you get there, when you begin to establish your business, when you begin to pull crops out of the ground, when you begin to make more money, when you get more of these, don't forget the Lord your God, and don't forget that He is the one that gives you the power to make wealth. Don't forget. I remember years ago there was a man, he was married to one of the women in the church that I knew, and she was a very faithful Christian, and for some reason he was very antagonistic toward the idea of God. And he had built his own business making these sauces, and he was marketing them in a lot of stores and farmers markets and grocery stores, and actually became very successful to the point where he was able to quit his other job and live strictly on that. And I remember one of his comments one day was, I've been very successful at what I do, and God had nothing to do with it. And what this text reminds us is, don't be like that. Don't be like that. Remember, your blessings ultimately come from God. He is the one that gives you the ability to make wealth. Don't be like that. And that brings us to the second point. Okay, not only do we recognize that God is the source of all our blessings, we need to honor God with all of our resources. Honor God with all of our resources. After all, it all belongs to God anyway, right? 24th Psalm says, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. God says in the 50th Psalm that everything, every animal in the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. And God says, if I were hungry, God doesn't get hungry, but if I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you because it all belongs to me anyway. In other words, I don't need anything from you. It all belongs to me. And so it all belongs to God in the first place. So what is this giving back to God? What is that all about? It's all about honoring God with our resources. Turn to Luke chapter 12 with me, if you would. Jesus tells a story here about a man who engaged in business and was wildly successful. His portfolio was bursting at the seams. And let's go ahead and read the story. Luke chapter 12, beginning with verse 16. Actually, let's back up and give a little bit of context here. Verse 13 of Luke chapter 12. I'll wait for the pages to quit turning. Okay. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus said, "Man, who appointed me a judge or arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out, be on guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And he told them this parable. "The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, 'What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops.' Then he said, 'This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?' Jesus says, this is how it will be with those who store up things for themselves but are not rich toward God." So here was a man who was wildly successful. He was so successful he decided, you know what, I can take early retirement. Maybe I can retire down to Panama. Maybe he dreamed about days on end at the golf course and at the beach and doing all of these things of leisure. I'm just going to enjoy life because things have been so successful. And then God says, "You're going to die tonight." That kind of puts a perspective on all of that. You know, I wonder if the man in the story would have started thinking about, okay, what is the wealth? What's it all worth to me now? I mean, what does it all mean? What have I done with my life? Have I ever done anything meaningful? You know, when you realize that your life is about to end, then the perspective changes on what wealth is all about. Life is more. What did Jesus say? Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. What was the problem with this guy? Was it that he was saving up money? I don't think so. Was it that he was saving for the future, putting away for retirement? Well, I'm not sure that was a problem either. I think the problem, well, what did Jesus say? He wasn't rich toward God. He was centered on himself. It was all about me, all about my enjoyment. And you get the picture here that this guy was all about that. And if somebody came and wanted his money, oh, wait a minute, this is mine. I've earned it. And this is what I'm going to spend on my retirement. And so he wasn't rich toward God. You know, as I was reading this passage last week, it made me think of Joe Thomas. He was here not too long ago and spoke to us. I don't know how much you know about those guys, the Sojourners. But a lot of those folks, what they have elected to do in their retirement is to spend their resources helping Christians, helping churches, bringing people to Christ, doing ministry. I remember it's been about 15 years ago, there was a man by the name of Don Brock, a member of the church. And Don and Sharon had made the decision to sell the farm. He had a farm down south of Leavenworth, Kansas. And he and his wife decided to sell the farm, and they took all of the proceeds and bought an RV. I didn't realize how expensive those things can be when you buy a nice RV. But he bought an RV, and they spent the next 10, 12 years traveling across the country, bringing people to Christ. They now live down in Niceville, Florida. His health got to the point where traveling became pretty difficult. But he said he felt very blessed that he was able to do that in his retirement. And I remember one of the things he said during one of our meetings where we were working together. He said, you know, when you retire, you don't retire from God. You don't retire from ministry. You don't retire from service. In fact, that's the time when you are able to do some of the things that you weren't able to do before because you were tied to your job. And that's the type of spirit, I think, that Jesus is teaching us here. It's not all about the money, but it's about the resources that we can use to serve others and do that in the name of Christ. And so the question I need to ask is, what would it look like if I were to honor God with my resources? You know there's a blessing that comes along with that. 3rd chapter of Proverbs says to honor the Lord from your wealth. And it says that He will bless you. And I remember Don saying that his blessing was that he now has brethren all over the country that he did not have before. And God worked through him and Sharon to do that. What would it look like for me to honor God with my resources? Maybe I need to take inventory of my resources. I have time, right? All of us have time. You know, I have a place that I live. Maybe I've got a car that I drive. There are things that God has given to us that maybe we haven't even thought about that we can bless other people with. And I do have money too. How would it look if I were to honor God with my resources? I don't have to go to Africa. I don't have to buy an RV to do so. But I can use what God has given to me to bless other people and to minister to other people. Maybe I know how to fix cars, and I can use that when somebody's car breaks down to help them fix their car. Maybe I know how to clean really well, and somebody is not able to clean their house, and maybe I can help clean their house. And Jesus says when we do these sorts of things, then we are laying up treasure in heaven. We're laying up treasure in heaven. That brings me to the third point. Not only do we need to recognize God as the source of our blessings, not only do we need to honor God with our resources, but number 3, we need to be good stewards of our resources. The Bible calls us stewards, which means we have been entrusted to manage the resources that God has given to us. How do we do that? How do we practice good stewardship? Number 1, if you're taking notes, number 1, live within the margin. Live within the margin. You know, one of the leaders of the church that I came from, he's an old lieutenant colonel. He always used to say this all the time to people. If you are early, then you're not what? Then you're not late. Such a simple thing. If you're early, then you're not late. In other words, give yourselves extra time. Because if you try to be on time, what you're going to wind up doing is spend 15 minutes trying to be on time in order to be 5 minutes late. And so give yourself some extra time. The same principle applies to money. Don't spend all your money. Plan for money left over. You know, Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 11 says, as goods increase, so do those who consume them. What advantage is there? I could be the type of person that lives on less than I make. I could be the type of person that lives on exactly what I make. Or I could be the type of person that lives on more than what I make. And those last two are always going to wind up being difficult. I need to plan on living on less than what I make. Number 2, don't spend what you don't have. You know what happens if you try to spend what you don't have? You're going to be making a lot of visits to the pawn shop. You might start selling your plasma. You might start having to sell away other things that you didn't intend on doing, and you wind up getting stuck. Title loans and other sorts of things that keep you stuck in debt. Look at this passage from Proverbs chapter 6. Proverbs chapter 6. The wise man says this, my son, if you have put up security for your neighbor, if you have shaken hands in pledge for a stranger, you have been trapped by what you said and snared by the words of your mouth. So do this, my son, to free yourself. Since you have fallen into your neighbor's hands, go to the point of exhaustion and give your neighbor no rest. Allow no sleep to your eyes, no slumber to your eyelids. Free yourself like a gazelle from the hand of the hunter, like a bird from the snare of the fowler. You see how this describes what it's like being in debt? If you are in debt, he's saying get out of debt as fast as you can. Because, you know, debt is kind of like a form of slavery. And if you get yourself into debt, sometimes it's impossible to get out of debt if that's the way you live your life. So don't spend what you don't have. Basically, that's putting yourself into debt. You know, that reminds me of my dad when we were growing up. I don't think I can very rarely do I ever recall him buying anything on credit. In fact, I remember I used to complain, well, they have cable TV. Why don't we have cable TV? They have a VCR. Why don't we have... I guess VCR is old school now, isn't it? But we didn't have a lot of the stuff that other people had. And part of the reasons is, I think, looking back, is that he wanted us to live within our means and have money left over. When an emergency came up, he always had the money in order to take care of that. And I think that was probably the reason why. You know, it's interesting. The Hebrew word for interest, and when you go into the debt, there's always interest attached here, right? The Hebrew word for interest is neshek. And the root meaning of that word originally was to bite off. Think about that. Interest. Biting off a portion. And if you're always in debt, then that interest is constantly eating away at you. Being in debt is a biting off of little pieces of your life. So don't spend what you don't have. Number 3, save and plan. Go back to Proverbs chapter 6 and continue reading. Okay, after the wise man says, avoid debt, and if you're in debt, get out of it, he says in verse 6, go to the ant, you sluggard, consider its ways and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler, yet it stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest. How long will you lie there, O sluggard? When will you get up from your sleep? A little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come on you like a thief, and scarcity like an armed man. Here's an ant, no commander. In other words, no one's telling him what to do, and yet he spends the good days planning and storing up for the future. The rich man that Jesus told about, the problem wasn't that he wasn't planning for the future, because it affirms it here. But plan and save for the future. You know what that's called, a financial plan? We call that a budget. We call that a budget. I remember in my early days, I learned the hard way what a budget is and the value of having a budget. And it's not all that difficult. You just inventory your resources, and then you inventory what your expenses are, and make sure that you plan appropriately and make sure that you plan to have extra in the future. Because you know what the blessing is of having extra? When a need arises, somebody's in need, you have resources in order to help. And then what the Bible says, work with your hands something useful so that you have something to share with those who are in need. Or if there's an opportunity to go on a mission trip, I have the resources in order to be able to do that. Or if an emergency comes up, I have the ability to take care of that as well. Number 4, share in the name of Christ. Share in the name of Christ. 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy chapter 6. 17, verses 17 through 19. It says, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain. And I know some people said, I learned that back in 2008. You remember that back in 2008? Don't put your hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, to be generous and willing to share. And so, share in the name of Christ. And then finally, number 5, be content. Be content. Verse 5 of 1 Timothy chapter 6 says this. Actually, that's the middle of a sentence, but I'll go ahead and start there anyway. Constant friction between people of corrupt mind who have been robbed of the truth. They think that godliness is a means of financial gain. But, verse 6, he says, godliness with contentment is great gain. In other words, You don't need a whole lot of these to be content, right? You know, there's a proverb that says, give me neither poverty nor wealth, but give me my daily bread. And that, along with contentment, there is no greater blessing. There are things more important in life than this. And if we do these things, it'll help us to be good stewards of the resources that God has given to us. You know, I've heard it said that, you know, the most important thing when it comes to my family is not if I spent extra hours to make a few extra of these. The most important thing, the things that my children are going to remember, is not if I had some extra of this. The things that my children will remember is if I was there, if I was present, if I spent time with them. You know, some of the people that had the most blessed childhoods are some of the ones that grew up the most poor. And the reason is because the most important thing was the relationship that they had with their family growing up. There are things that are more important than money. Make the most of your money. Hopefully these principles we looked at this morning will be a blessing to us. And you know, every time we come here on Sunday morning, I'm reminded of what God has given up for us. What God invested in us and what God continues to invest in us. He gave everything that He could in order for us to be reconciled to Him as His children. And if you have not accepted His Lordship over your life, if you've not been baptized and if you've not been born again, then don't wait another day. If you're ready to accept Him as your Lord and as your Savior, do that today. If you have, that means you now belong to Him and you're His steward. Make the most of what God has entrusted to you. Won't you come as we stand?